Okay, so in this module, we're going to talk about how to evaluate research evidence. Obviously, that's very important. As a consumer, as somebody who wants to know what are the potential harms or the potential benefits, and looking to the research evidence, one needs to understand how much confidence to have in a given study. So we're going to start off with this topic of what is the evidence for your beliefs about cannabis. And there are several different sources, and one of them is your own experience, right? So maybe at some point in your life you tried cannabis and it made you less anxious, right? Or maybe at some point you tried it and it made you super paranoid and uncomfortable. So experience is one of the things that we use to generate beliefs. Intuition is another. And so, maybe there are certain things about cannabis that you find intuitively attractive, like, oh, it's natural, so I feel better about it, right? Another source of beliefs or something that can influence your belief are basically figures of authority. So as a quick example, maybe you're a big Jeff Sessions fan, who you probably remember was the former Attorney General, and he says that cannabis is as bad as heroin, and so that's your starting point in terms of what you think about cannabis. So the point in this slide is there are several different sources of information that may influence our beliefs about cannabis. So there are personal sources, and there also is empirical evidence. And if you think about it, the personal sources are oftentimes biased. The whole point of having empirical evidence, of having research, is that we want to understand if something works or not, and having empirical evidence, having appropriately done research is superior to personal sources of information in terms of getting it right. So what do experience and intuition and authority all have in common? Those sources of information all have one important piece in common, and that is there's no comparison group, no control group. Well, what is a control group, and why do we need a control group? So here's an example. So let's say we have this person, our friend up here, Amanda, who has been experiencing pain in her lower back, and this is the kind of pain that's chronic. It's interfering with her daily activities. She wants to fix it. Her intuition tells her that she should try cannabis to help with her pain. And so Amanda eats a cannabis edible every day for 3 weeks, and her pain goes from a consistent 8 on a 10-point scale to a 4. And she feels great. So can Amanda conclude that cannabis is the cause of her reduction in pain? Why or why not? So let's talk about this for a minute in terms of what a control group is and why it's important. And in that example previously, clearly there is no control group. So let's just think about how this might work if you're only basing it on your experience, like Amanda might be, versus an actual study with the control group. So here's an example, right? Maybe with no control group, there's a group of people, not just one person like Amanda, but a group of people, and they're looking at whether their pain was reduced by cannabis or not reduced by cannabis. And so there's 50 total people, and for 40 of them, the pain was reduced by cannabis, and for 10, it was not reduced. And so the percent with reduced pain is 75% of these people basically said that their pain was reduced, right? That seems pretty good. Sort of a smiley face here in terms of the effects of cannabis. Maybe a different 50 people find out, they do the same kind of thing, And for 25 of them, their pain was reduced. And for 25 of them, the pain was not reduced, right? So roughly half of them, their pain was reduced. So we're not, so super happy anymore because it's obviously not as good as 75%, but there's still some evidence there. Maybe that does something. Versus this third option where maybe for 10 people, pain was reduced, and for 40, it was not reduced. So only 25% are showing reduction in pain. And so that's not all that great, right? All of this is with no control group, a control group that got no cannabis, right? So now let's add the control group and let's look at how these things might be different. So before we were excited about 75% showing a decrease in pain, but when we have a control group and we find out the same numbers, right, 75% show a decrease in pain over time, now we're not so excited because the cannabis group and the control group are showing the same level of pain reduction. And what that probably means is that pain is just getting better over time. Maybe it was sort of peaking at the beginning, and then over the course of using the cannabis or no cannabis, it basically was reduced in both groups and not differentially. So let's look at this other example where it was 50% before, right? But when we have a control group, we find out that people who did not get cannabis, only 10 of them show a reduction in pain, and 40 of them don't show a reduction in pain. So when we compare the cannabis to the no cannabis, even though 50% didn't seem like a great number before, when you compare it to 25%, that seems like a pretty good number, right? 50% show reduction with cannabis, only 25% show reduction without cannabis. And then finally, down here, this other scenario where 25% showed a reduction in pain, which didn't seem very good, right? Only 25% of people show a reduction in pain. Well, that's not very good. But when you compare it to the no cannabis condition, what you see is only 10% showed a reduction in pain, and 25% definitely better than 10%, and that's somewhat surprising, right? Because before we were not excited about the 25%. So the point here is that it's really important to have a control group in order to interpret the results of the cannabis condition. And so one would never know, for example, with Amanda, since she only took the brownie with cannabis and her pain got better, it's entirely possible it would have gotten better without the cannabis. And we wouldn't know that for sure unless we had both the cannabis group and the control group. Okay, so another point here is that our experience is confounded, right? So there are other things going on. I mentioned before that maybe pain just gets better over time. Maybe it would typically get worse over time. Maybe people are not just using cannabis, but they're also using meditation. There are other factors that are going on in life. You're not sleeping, you're stressed out, you're exercising, which is good. Maybe you have a crazy roommate or some crazy cats. The point is there are always other variables out there that may influence, for example, whether you're experiencing pain or not pain, whether you're experiencing anxiety or not anxiety. And so control groups help us to control for some of these extra variables. Okay, so what is a confound? A confound, when we talk about a confound, we're talking about an alternative explanation for your finding. There's some other variable that might have caused, or been associated with your finding. So in research, is there anything other than the manipulated variable that might have caused the result? So is there something else besides cannabis that might have caused the results. Or in Amanda's studies, or anything other than cannabis that might have caused her pain to lessen over time. That's another way to look at this. So, okay, so research versus intuition. Intuition is biased in two important ways, and what it comes down to is we are motivated, perceivers, and so thinking that one of these types of bias is thinking the easy way, right? The good story, present bias, availability heuristic. We'll talk about what these mean in a second. Also, thinking what we want, right? So this is also a source of bias where we cherry pick the evidence to be consistent with what we want, or there's some confirmation bias. We're biased towards things that confirm our pre-existing beliefs. So what is the good story? Well, here's an example. In the 1950s and 1960s, the prevailing theory for why some children develop the condition of autism had to do with poor parenting. So basically, the story was poor parenting led to autism. Ignored by their parents, these children turn instead to the comfort of their inner selves. Now, that makes some sense on some level, right? I mean, as a theory, but turns out that was actually not the case, right? Okay, so, but it sounded good at the time. It made sense. There's another bias here called the present bias. So, for example, the statement, a girl I know took LSD and she was happy, right? Well, can you conclude that LSD made her happy? Well, what about, for example, the girl who took LSD and wasn't happy and had a bad trip? In that case, right, LSD, yes, is present, but happiness is not there. Or the girl who didn't take LSD and was happy, right? Turns out happiness and LSD are not necessarily linked together. Or the girl who didn't take LSD and wasn't happy. So all these different possibilities exist. And remember that you need to explore the results from multiple people in both the experimental and control condition. And that's how you know it's not a present bias. Okay, what about the availability heuristic? The availability heuristic means that things that come easily to mind can sometimes guide our thinking, right? And so here's an example of the availability heuristic. Which are deadlier, sharks or horses? Right? What comes to mind if you ask yourself the question, which are deadlier, sharks or horses? And let's see if I can pull up this YouTube video real fast on sharks and horses.
Which should we be more afraid of, sharks or horses? Before we answer that, let's consider two more questions. Which kills more people each year? Car accidents, homicide, and suicide combined, or cancer? And are there more English words that start with the letter R, or if R is a third letter? When answering questions like these offhand, we tend to think in terms of examples and assume that the more examples we can remember, the more common a thing is. Unfortunately, we remember some things much more easily than others, so this availability heuristic can lead us to make really bad assessments of risk. Things that are more commonly and vividly shown in the media, like a violent murder, will be a lot easier to remember than things that are far more common in real life, but aren't as dramatic, like a cancer patient dying peacefully at home. Likewise, thinking of things in familiar ways, like alphabetical order, is a lot easier than new ways, like third letter order. But if we actually count the words, this intuition turns out to be wrong. More than twice as many words have R as the third letter than first letter. We can see this same effect happening in public policy. Americans spend 25 times more money fighting terrorism than fighting cancer, even though cancer kills almost 2,000 times as many people. Both policymakers and the public who elect them remember dramatic episodes of terrorism much more readily than boring statistics about cancer, and that's how priorities are set. The only way to avoid this availability bias is to decide based on statistics, not the news. We just can't trust our intuition to realistically calculate risks. So, which causes more deaths, Jaws or My Little Pony? Sorry, sharks, horses are the real killers.
Horses are the real killers. So, but sharks are what come to mind given the availability heuristic, because people who are killed with sharks are much more likely to end up in the media. Okay, so another issue here is cherry picking the evidence. So global warming can't be real, right? Because it snowed every week of the spring semester. In fact, I'm looking out the window right now, and it's the middle of May, and it's still snowing here in Colorado, right? And can I then assume that global warming isn't real? No. Cherry picking the evidence is not a good way to make decisions about what's real and what's not real. So in any case, another example here is he definitely likes me. He always texts me back when I text him. Another example of cherry picking the evidence. I don't have a drinking problem. I never drink before 10 a.m. That is called cherry picking the evidence. Okay, so let's talk more about confirmation bias. So who are the people most likely to watch MSNBC versus who are the people most likely to watch Fox News? Obviously, people will watch the programming that most closely fits their own bias, and that can lead to confirmation bias. So basically, getting confirmation that what you think is true is really true because of the source of your information. So biases of intuition. We just talked about these: the good story, the present bias, availability heuristic, cherry picking evidence, and confirmation bias. All of these can lead to making conclusions that are false. And carefully conducted research attempts to avoid all of these types of biases to lead you to the right or the correct conclusion. So just a little bit more here, trusting authority. What does that mean? Define authority. Well, maybe your big brother, maybe Fox News or MSNBC. And so are peer-reviewed empirical studies a good authority? And obviously peer-reviewed empirical studies are much more likely to get it right than simply somebody you might see as an authority. So it's important to watch out for bias from authority. Authorities can also cherry pick the evidence that supports their position and then pass that on to you. Authorities can base their advice on their own experience and intuition, which we just talked about a few minutes ago. Does not always lead you to the correct conclusion. Authorities may be citing unreliable research. If you don't know what the source of their research is, how would you know if it's reliable? Always ask, and this is particularly true in a field like cannabis that's polarized on sometimes political dimensions. Always ask, what is the evidence behind that statement, behind that conclusion? If the person in authority can cite reliable, peer-reviewed scientific evidence, there's less possibility of bias for that particular authority figure. Okay, to summarize, good evidence comes from empirical studies that have the following attributes: that utilize a large representative sample, include a control or comparison group, have strong internal and external validity, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture, and have been through the process of peer review. So in this next lecture, coming right up, we're going to dive into the details a little bit more in terms of what makes a strong study. And remember, the goal here is for everybody to be an informed consumer of the evidence. And this is true for lots of things, but especially especially true for cannabis because there is, as we talked about in one of the last lectures, there's this big gap between the research and what's being said out there in the sort of marketing world, right? That the marketing's gotten far, far ahead of the research. And so it's very important to be an informed consumer about this information and about the evidence. And that's why we're focusing on that in this module.